Thank you, Judith. We'll get through this efficiently. Yeah, managed the AV operator. All right, so let's do a roll call. You want to start out that end?
Commissioner Siegel, present.
Commissioner Johnston, present.
Commissioner Danaher, present.
Commissioner Schwartz, present.
Commissioner Forsyth, present.
Council Liaison Dubois, present.
All right, so we do have one oral communication. Tom Cabot, formerly a longtime member of the Utilities Department, would like to talk to us. Tom, welcome.
All right, thank you very much. Today I'm here as a volunteer for a little group called Carbon Free Silicon Valley that tries to help different cities pursue their climate action plans. One thing I did about a year ago was a lot of research at the Palo Alto Historical Archives to look at the history of the gas utility and to find that it really has a fascinating history of fuel switching, and that's where it comes from, and many business pivots as the situation around them changed and they could keep improving the environment for Palo Altans. And so that was really fun. And so take a quick look at what they did. So when they were founded, when the whole city was founded, soon after, private companies were delivering firewood and oil and kerosene, and that's how folks lighted and cooked and warmed things. And then in 1904, the city signed a franchise agreement with a newly formed private gas company who cooked oil in a sealed container to make manufactured gas or town gas. And it was mostly methane and carbon monoxide. And they piped it into homes and businesses where it would be burned and could do lighting and cooking. And it reduced soot and smoke because it was displacing firewood. In 1917, the city purchased and took over that town gas system, and they noticed the leakage was over 10%. In 1929, the city connected to the PG&E natural gas system. So when you hear natural gas, it's no longer manufactured by cooking oil. It used to come artisanally out of the ground when you drill for oil. Now it doesn't come artisanally anymore. We've run out of that. They frack for it. Okay, so natural gas came in 1929. And then the leakage had grown to more than 20% from that aging first-generation pipe system. The city started replacing gas mains and reduced it for a while. In the 1940s, the gas storage tanks that they had moved in to meet peaking needs, they moved them to 1100 Middlefield Road and also to where Rinconada Park is. Those, they removed by the 1940s. They found they were a stranded asset. They didn't want to keep them in town, so they got rid of them. In the 1950s, they put in a third generation of pipes to cut the leakage that had grown back up to 12% down to 4%. And the utility was promoting fuel switching again. I found newspaper ads with rebates for marketing people to change from wood cook stoves in the 1950s to gas cook stoves. So again, fuel switching to cut down on local environmental problems. In the 1980s, the modern solar heating programs and efficiency programs were developed, but those only lasted a few years. By 1987, energy gluts and regulatory relaxation and also kind of a silence on the climate problem had kind of stacked up against those programs. And so the city quit doing bulk buys of insulation, solar equipment, and quit doing financing. And then it's really great to see, again, in 2017, I think it is, the startup of the heat pump water heater program, another fuel switching for local benefits and also climate protection. So the question, when you look at the great history of solving problems, producing benefits, using their skills at what they're doing, how might the gas utility help meet the city and state climate goals? Could it demonstrate the evolution from a chemical delivery utility to becoming a thermal services utility? And could it apply its directional boring technology and its pipe acumen and its fluid management ability to making carbon-free thermal district loops and energy storage loops? So just a few thoughts to start pondering about, can it do another great pivot? Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much. Good things to wonder about. All right, next item are the minutes for the last meeting. And comments, please, from commissioners. Warren, I think you mentioned that shows Arnie Ballantyne is absent when actually he had resigned. It shouldn't be shown as absent. It's just a vacancy right now. Did you have other comments on that? Okay, Judith?
So on page 7 of 11, it was actually Commissioner Siegel who said that she believed the council should decide whether anybody pays for additional costs. And then on the next paragraph, I think that the way this is phrased, I think Chair Danaher misunderstood what I was saying, but it's presented here as if it's what I said. So I would ask that you strike the line that says Vice Chair Schwartz appears to be less inclined to allow a choice, to delete that line, and that what I said was that while it is important to listen to community concerns, she thinks it would be a better choice to find 8 to 10 households that are willing to host pad-mounted equipment.
Okay, any other comments? Is there a motion to approve the minutes with Judith's proposed amendment?
So moved.
Second, in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And if you maybe hand that to Dave later so they have that. Thank you. Agenda review and revisions. Any comments on the agenda? All right, we'll stick with that. Reports from commissioner meetings and events. Okay.
Sure, so last night I attended the Recycled Water Strategic Plan public meeting led by Public Works. I thought it was a very clear and helpful presentation and laid out what are the current possible options for recycled water use, both potable and non-potable. And then there was a lively Q&A with enough time to allow all comments from all attendees, even multiple comments. And I would encourage everyone to look at the slides. I thought they were super informative and clear.
Were you left with the impression there are a lot of opportunities to reuse water?
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of opportunities and different economic structures and different timelines, both potable, non-potable, within the city and beyond the city.
Okay, and are the slides available where?
Catherine, are you here? I think they are going to be posted.
We
Is it
can,
public?
oh, you,
Catherine Elvert, Utilities Communications Manager. I don't believe that the slides were published anywhere, like in a public forum, a website. We can check in with the Public Works Department about that because I think it'd be valuable information for us to be able to share, and we can certainly share that with the UAC.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I would love to see it available to the public because while the discussion was vibrant, what did not come up with the attendees was any impression or comment in terms of some of the potable reuse options, and it would be helpful if the community had access to it, and maybe we'll hear some commentary that way.
I'm sure there will be some follow-up after we gather all the feedback. Thank you.
Along the same lines, I went to a presentation last night by a Stanford professor, Richard Luhe, who's a professor basically of water engineering. He's a chemical engineer, but his field is water engineering, and he was talking about water recycling, both recycling treated water at the treatment plant and stormwater runoff. He was talking a lot about projects that are happening around the state, particularly in Southern California. I'll see if I can get copies of the slides that he was showing, but it would be an interesting, I think it would be interesting for us to hear from him about some of the options that people are doing, including experiments that they're doing at Stanford.
We might note that when we talk about the rolling forecast, if we have another maybe session this year on water reuse and water planning, to hear some of these things.
So this month, I went to the Energy Thought Leadership Summit in Austin, Texas first, which brought together people from, actually all over the country, though heavily concentrated in Texas. And there were a lot of interesting talks. One of the things that really pleased me was that a lot of the discussions about customer engagement and what works, that I've been pushing for the last decade, I'm actually seeing, where people are starting to talk about this, that different utilities are doing it. And there are a lot of really good programs that are putting people first and doing that. So I think that's a very encouraging thing. Another thing that I think was relevant were there were a lot of discussions about, so most of the participating utilities that were there already have AMI, and there was a lot of discussion about both data privacy as well as access and how do you do good data governance, and it was a big issue. And one of the things that it suggests to me is that we should get ahead of the curve before we start having this tsunami of data and really sort of understand what's involved so that we can make sure our legacy systems are in line, and that, because that was one of the things that came out, is that a lot of times what people were concerned about was they couldn't lay their hands on everything, and they were nervous about where it was or was it clean or whatever. And it happens to coincide with the publication that DOE has finally produced of their AMI, what happens with the data and how all the benefits that are there. And I'll make sure that they send it to everybody so that you can all get it. But it really gets at a lot of the benefits of AMI that go way beyond whatever the business cases were that were originally done. There are a lot of great things, both technically and on the customer side, that are proving to be very helpful in jurisdictions where they have this technology. Then the other event I went to was the Low Income Energy Issues Forum, which was hosted by ComEd in Chicago. And I gave a presentation on low-income community solar, which was an update to the report I had, the presentations that I had done, the big report on. And one of the things that was a theme that came out is this idea of community and connection, and that community solar projects end up being part of microgrids and other kinds of applications that are around sustainability, and community buy-in that may be issues that are going to be quite valuable for Palo Alto, despite the fact that we have our portfolio so heavily invested in solar. When it's combined with other things, it actually can be very valuable at the local level. So that's my report for this month.
Thank you. Lisa, anything to? Okay, all right. We'll move on to the next agenda item, reports from General Manager of Utilities report.
Thank you, Chair Danaher. Jonathan Aubenschein, Assistant Director of Utility Resource Management. Unfortunately, our Utility Director, Dean Batchelor, is sick, so Dave Yen, our Strategic Business Manager, and I will be handling the meeting tonight. So without further ado, I'll give the General Manager's report. We've already talked about this a little bit, but there was a recycled water strategic plan public meeting last night. It was hosted by Utilities, Public Works, and Valley Water. The idea was to request input on possible projects the city could explore for expanding the use of recycled water from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant. The information presented was similar to what was presented to the UAC back in October 2018, so you should see, and to the City Council at a December 2018 study session, so you should see some similar themes when we get those slides out to you. The discussion included options for both non-potable and potable uses of recycled water, and we're hoping to be able to follow up with interested stakeholders after reviewing the public feedback. Moving on to utilities rate adjustments. Staff has been developing a communication strategy and public outreach materials for the utility rate changes that are proposed to take effect on July 1st, 2019, and you should have copies of that in front of you. The document you have in front of you is going to be
Commissioners, my understanding is Catherine circulated those, prepared quickly to get any feedback that you might give her individually or suggestions.
That would be great.
on
We
that.
would love to have your feedback. This is a draft document. There's still more work to be done, but we'd love your initial feedback about what you'd like to see in that. So this document and other documents based on it will be circulated through a wide variety of outreach channels, including the web, utility bill inserts, social media, and digital and print announcements. All of the water and wastewater customers will also receive a printed letter in the mail within the next 1 to 2 weeks, so those are already going out. And they'll have details on the water and wastewater rates and some mention of the electric and gas rates. And that's to comply with our notification requirements under Prop 218. An update on the cross-bore program. The city's cross-bore verification program investigates privately owned and city-owned sewer lines to ensure there are no natural gas lines that are accidentally what we call cross-bored through them. So a gas line is bored through a sewer line. The risk there is that somebody tries to clean out the sewer line and cuts through the gas line. They are pretty rare. The utilities video inspects sanitary sewer laterals, and they make repairs free of charge to customers if we find a cross-bore. Phase 1 of this program was completed in 2013, and at that time we identified 26 cross-bores that were subsequently repaired and verified that more than 7,000 other parcels were clear of a potential cross-bore. Phase 2 of the program is going to include a 2-year contract to inspect the remaining sewer laterals, specifically those at a variety of locations through the city that have been determined to be a higher priority for inspection, so higher risk laterals. The city received 4 bids from qualified contractors for the Phase 2 contract, and a bid submitted by AIMS companies came in at 45% lower than the staff's initial engineering estimate, which was great. And since this leaves some available funding in our budget, we're going to take that opportunity to increase the number of sewer laterals that we inspect. We're going to take it from 1,200 to 2,500 locations. Council approval is scheduled for June 24th, and the total not to exceed contract amount is $1.7 million. And then we've had some media coverage of Palo Alto's energy resources. There's been a local reporter for the Palo Alto Weekly who's recently been publishing blog posts about our utilities energy resources portfolio. After speaking with the communications and resource planning staff, she's now writing a series of well-informed educational articles that will help share with the public more about what we do for environmental sustainability. The media coverage provides an insightful look at how we procure energy resources, what's considered renewable versus non-renewable energy, what is a consumer choice aggregation, consumer choice aggregator, a CCA, and related legislation that could impact both publicly owned utilities like us and the CCAs, and that could also impact what it means to be considered carbon neutral. So we encourage you to take a look at the blog. It's titled A New Shade of Green in Palo Alto Online, and I think we'll also forward that out to all of you. And then the Mayor's Green Business Award is coming up, so join us at that presentation at the City Council on May 20th. The award program, the Mayor's Green Business Award, recognizes property managers whose buildings earned an EPA Energy Star, LEED Gold, or Platinum status. This year, we're going to be honoring 27 buildings representing over 2 million square feet of commercial space. And all of these were Energy Star rated in 2018. And we also have 6 properties that became LEED Gold certified, as well as 1 property that obtained the elite LEED Platinum status. The award ceremony will take place at the beginning of the May 20th City Council meeting. And that's all I have for you folks tonight.
Thanks very much. There is no unfinished business because the first agenda item was moved from last time. So on today's agenda, carbon emissions accounting, and Jonathan for your team.
Great. So I'd like to welcome Lena Perkins, acting senior resource planner with us, and also Jim Stack is on the phone with us remotely, also senior resource planner, and they'll be presenting on the the content of carbon in our electric portfolio. This is meant to be a informational introduction about some different accounting methodologies, and we expect to follow this with another discussion in June to talk about what we're actually going to, what we actually recommend we do with respect to our portfolio. So I'll turn it over to Lena.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, commissioners. And again, my name is Lena Perkins, and Jim Stack is on the phone, and I just want to mention that I'm presenting largely Jim's work here, and that it is a true joy to work with Jim. And so, but he is in Seattle right now, so but if there are any questions that I can't answer, he will be there as well. All right, and again, the purpose of the talk today is to present the results of an hourly carbon emissions accounting that we did of our 2018 portfolio. Okay. The purpose and outline for this evening is to present the results of that hourly carbon emissions accounting for Palo Alto. And then a secondary point is to share separate but related changes coming from the state, from the California Energy Commission, related to how our portfolio appears to customers on the power content label that they receive every month. And the important thing to take away there is that separate from anything we do with our portfolio, our current portfolio will appear dirtier to customers starting next year, looking at the 2019 power content label. So, and then we also want to share the implications of changing to a minimally RPS compliant portfolio, which is what we were previously advised to do, and how that will make our electric portfolio appear even dirtier on that power content label. So the specific items we're seeking feedback on is, should we change from an annual to hourly carbon emissions accounting for the purposes of Palo Alto's carbon neutral compliance? And if so, what method should we use to clean up those residual emissions if there's any difference between hourly and annual accounting? And then how to address the communication challenges if the city's accounting approach differs from the accounting of the state, as well as, again, how this change to a minimally RPS compliant portfolio will affect how dirty our electricity appears to customers. So this is going to be a lot of information, and like Jonathan said, there'll be a follow-up in June. So we're trying to provide two presentations.
So Lena, if I
Yes.
may, there's a lot of charts in here about how an hourly makes a difference relative to annual. The commission probably understands that very well. So
Okay.
you can condense that part of it and spend more time on the other parts of your presentation, if you were planning to go through those charts in great detail.
Yeah, I can. Please feel free to tell me to skip
All right.
slides. I want to be as brief and succinct as possible, and that is good to know.
Okay.
I have some comments on the chart, so.
Oh, okay, all right. Judith will have comments on the chart, so.
Okay. So we've had many discussions, mostly related to the Electric Integrated Resources Report that we filed yesterday with the state, that's starting back in September of 2017, coming to, this is April from last month, discussion of hourly carbon emissions accounting. The Palo Alto carbon neutral electric supply was established in 2013. It is annual basis, and that made sense at the time because the emissions of the grid did not vary much throughout the course of the year. This is also consistent with the climate registry protocol. As you can see, our supply portfolio is here. These are months along the bottom, and this is our load versus supply. So we're long in the summer, short in the winter. Also in 2013, the duck curve first appears, and this is when solar and wind show up in the middle of the day in the spring and summer, and they back down natural gas generators, but when the solar and wind fall off towards the end of the day, the dirtiest generators come online to cover that evening ramp period. So everyone understands this. This has large implications for carbon emissions. Now, carbon emissions vary tremendously throughout the course of the day and throughout the course of the year. This is a snapshot from March 16th of this year. We have lots of hydro and solar and wind on the system, and you can see that the emissions of the grid vary eightfold throughout the course of a single 24-hour period. So, yeah, 3 charts here. I think you're familiar with all of them. Annual chart by months is on top. We're long in the summer, short in the winter. This is a 24-hour period, the bottom left for January. We're short throughout a 24-hour period in January, short all day long. In July, we're basically long all day long. And one thing I do want to draw your attention to for the bottom right chart for a typical day in July, you can see that we're very long in the evening hours, and that is because we're dispatching our hydro during those peak evening hours, which is actually that neck of the duct. That's the evening ramp period. So hydro is really showing up and displacing a lot of carbon in those hours. Okay, and then, as you said, there's a lot of charts, 6 different ways of looking at this portfolio. Breaking it down, we have time step granularity, annual versus hourly. You said you understand that very well, and I believe you. I believe you understand the whole thing very well. But, and then there are emissions intensity, average versus marginal. I'll go into that a little bit. The important thing to take away here is currently we're annual basis, and this is essentially an average annual. This is what we're doing right now. The second row is most appropriate hourly accounting using average emissions. If you're going to do a portfolio inventory, this is the most appropriate measure. These state 2020 changes relate to unbundled RECs. These are bucket 3 RECs. They're largely out of state. We'll go into them a little bit more in the next slide. But what that means is right now they show up as 0 carbon on our power content label, and starting next year, for this period that we are in right now, they are going to show up as carbon emitting on our power content label.
Quick question on that. Mm-hmm. When the report was written, it sounded like the California Energy Commission was still deciding. Has that decision in the intervening month come down, and so this is now a done deal?
It has not. They are still deciding, but they have been very consistent on this point. They are still deciding between bucket 2 and RECs, whether those are going to have an emissions associated with them and some other pieces. But throughout the course of over a year, they've been very consistent that there will be carbon emissions associated with bucket 3 RECs.
And is there a key point here to be made about how, under what circumstances we buy bucket 3 RECs?
Yeah, and bucket 3 RECs are what we buy when we have a below average hydro year, and we use those to green up our market purchases. So we buy unspecified market power because we do not have enough energy on an annual basis, and then we buy these out-of-state bucket 3 RECs, which carry the environmental attribute of that generated power, but that environmental attribute is generated in maybe Wyoming. It is not dispatched or correlated with our load or any ISO load or generation. It's just a market construct split off from, say, a wind turbine in Wyoming to provide another revenue source for that wind operator if the utility or customer does not care if that megawatt hour is renewable. And what that does is it can spur greater investment throughout the Western Interconnect in renewable energies because it makes those products more competitive.
In an average or even slightly below average hydro year, we wouldn't buy RECs.
Correct. You know, with our current portfolio and current load, it has to be a pretty substantially below hydro year. But under previous sort of guidance from the UAC, we were directed to maximize the cost effectiveness, that, get the most economical electric portfolio possible, which would mean procuring as many bucket 3 RECs as we were allowed under a minimally compliant RPS portfolio. And so then 10% of our load every year would be bucket 3 RECs and would look dirty on that power content label. So that's kind of previous direction before this regulatory ruling was coming out of the California Energy Commission. And now there are implications in how our portfolio appears. While it is still technically correct based on current laws and protocols in place, it will be a communications challenge to explain why 10% of that pie chart is dirty and carbon emitting.
I'm just finding the use of the word really loaded, that you keep saying dirtier. And I think what our whole thing has been about is to be accurate of what is really going on. So is it, I think to accurately reflect where the electrons are coming from is not a pejorative, and I think just continuing to frame it and hammer it home as dirtier is a kind of a simplistic way to look at it, when in fact we're also talking about reliability and our ability to have lights and heat at night. So I guess I just would caution the use of that word so
Sure.
emphatically.
I am just trying to use the simplest words possible since there are so many different words, but that's noted. I can say carbon emitting instead of dirtier, instead of carbon, carbon free, carbon emitting. Is that better?
Fine, but
Okay.
okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
The report talks about unbundled RECs, and we just introduced the bucket 3 as terminology. Those are equivalent?
These are the same, and that's on the next slide, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also, so if I understand correctly, we now, even in a wet hydro year, we sell our bundled RECs and buy unbundled RECs up to 10%? No, this is only a dry hydro year that the 10% is going to show up on the power content label.
Previous recommendation from the UAC was to maximize unbundled REC bucket 3 purchases in order to have the cheapest electricity portfolio possible. That's a minimally compliant RPS portfolio. And so if we have not implemented that to date, because we knew this change was coming down, and we also wanted to see how the markets evolved with respect to that.
So maybe breaking that down a little bit, right now we have about 10% more renewable energy or carbon-free energy than our load in an average hydro year. So we actually have a surplus on an annual basis. Our current definition of carbon neutrality is on an annual basis, and so we are meeting that definition and then some in an average hydro year. So if we have a pretty significantly below average hydro year and our renewable and carbon-free energy drops below 100%, then we would buy unbundled RECs under our current portfolio. What Lena's mentioning is that, we heard openness from the UAC to, try and reduce costs as much as possible. So if we were to preserve the annual accounting methodology, what that would mean is we, number one, get rid of that 10% surplus, drop down to an annual, drop down to make sure our renewable energy matches our load, and then we would sell some of that, even more of that renewable energy, that comes from long-term contracts, and would instead buy unbundled RECs from Wyoming. And if we were to do that, that would be the cheapest possible portfolio that is compliant with our own policies, but it would show up as carbon emitting under the CEC regulations. That's the point that we're trying to make.
So A, this isn't something that has yet happened. It's been discussed, but it hasn't happened. But it could, depending on how today and June and so forth go, could happen. But we're never talking about in a average year actually selling unbundled RECs and buying bundled RECs selling bundled recs and buying unbundled recs in order to arbitrage the unbundle financial opportunity?
Well, we have actually talked about that in a previous,
Okay.
so that's one
that's-
policy
that's
option
still
on the table. That's the
Yep.
cheapest possible compliant portfolio, so that is on the table. That's really, I think this topic is really more for the June discussion, what we actually do. I think what we're trying to focus on here is the,
Sorry to derail.
oh, no, not at all. We got that, we started the discussion. But I think we
And
just
this-
wanted to
this
clarify
is-
what unbundled recs were, that's all.
Yeah, and just to follow on, sorry, to that point, I mean, that is what a minimally compliant RPS portfolio is, and there is a difference between what the power content label shows and the RPS eligibility. And then also to actually correct one thing that I said, it's, I believe, 10% of our RPS compliance that would be potentially unbundled recs or bucket 3 recs. So if our RPS mandate is, 40% on this period ramping up, then it would be 4% of our portfolio that would appear dirty, 10% of the 40%. So that was my misspeaking.
I'm going to suggest just to keep order in our conversation. Let's talk about the accounting methodology. You've mentioned hourly versus annual. Let's talk about the marginal versus average. Get views of the commission on that, and then we'll talk about the rec.
Sure.
thing.
And so wrapping this up, in 2020, this is the change to the power content label. And if there's no change to the accounting today and we were to stick with the annual accounting, this change from the state would make our portfolio appear dirtier. This is just a quick definition of average versus marginal emissions. Would you like me to skip this? No. Okay.
Go
All right.
this part.
Average emissions are fairly straightforward. You have the total emissions of the grid divided by the total generation that's online at that time. Marginal emissions are the emissions intensity of the last unit called upon to deliver that last unit of electricity. So that last power plant that ramps on to deliver the last electron to a consumer. And it is very useful for thinking about an individual action, especially load shifting. And if you're looking at what are the carbon emissions of your entire portfolio on an inventory basis, it would not be appropriate for that, mostly because if every CCA and utility in the state used marginal emissions to sort of total up their net impact, it wouldn't add up to the actual total emissions, right? You can't count against the top one there. Are there any more questions on that?
Well, why don't we pause there and get commissioner feedback for them and questions on the charts as well, on the annual versus hourly and the marginal versus average. Does that make sense? Yeah, anybody have comments, questions about that or preferences on those particular points?
There are a lot more slides on those questions.
Yeah, and we can go into those in more detail if you want. I think the concepts are pretty clear without having to look at more duck curves, but
Yeah.
but we can certainly, if it would help to go into more slides, please direct her.
Or if you'd like me to jump to a certain slide, that's fine.
Yeah. Judith, I know you had comments.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thank you guys for doing this. This is wonderful, and I think that this really does demonstrate leadership in the industry to be doing this. So I think this is really terrific. So thank you. So one sort of minor comment, the charts, these charts, I noticed are on really different scales. So it makes it hard to compare because one is half the scale of the other. Is it possible to get the scales to be the same so you can kind of see how they really compare?
Yes, absolutely. And in one of the past presentations, I corrected those scales, and in this one, we didn't correct them, but I agree with you, and we can make sure that that's reflected going forward.
Okay. So, and from a positioning standpoint, I would like to propose the following, that we look at this as we're measuring true decarbonization, okay? And to define decarbonization as a process. It's not, that there's some magical goal and we're there, but that this is the process that we're doing to decarbonize. So the original comments of the, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, when he talked about the fuel switching and, the history of it, that as there are changes, there are going to continue to be changes. So I think the idea of that we make the point that this is an ongoing process, and I just think true decarbonization would be a better way to frame it. Then a question that I have is it, so I totally get the argument of why using the average hourly emission makes more sense. Okay, so that I get. For our existing portfolio, is it possible when we discuss things like electrification, which would change on the margins, that we could then do the analysis to say, this would be the difference because that's existing on the margins, because that means we're now going to need new capacity that we didn't need before, and so that really is a marginal picture. So is it possible, and not too complicated, to be able to sort of look at it, one is the main portfolio, and then what happens if if we start having everybody has a heat pump, what does that mean? So.
Do you want me to respond to that? Okay, yes, absolutely. We actually have a new reporting tool for energy efficiency that we've also folded our electrification measures into, and we are using marginal emissions for that tool. There is a bit of an academic discussion to be had. At what point is it a change, and at what point is it just part of the load makeup? But right now we are using marginal emissions to evaluate and account for heat pump water heaters that we incent.
Well, first, I want to commend you as well, and the department, for putting this together. I had questions on these my first meeting as a commissioner a long time back, so it's really great to see really thorough analysis. So let me put this out as a straw man. I think our goal is to be as accurate as possible on what is our carbon load, and that sounds hourly is much more accurate than annual. And I just want to ask fellow commissioners if everybody agrees with that. I see nods around there. So, all right, you got that point done. I also understand your point that average, we are an average user. We're not the last one to come online, and that average makes more sense than marginal. It's a methodology everybody can apply, and marginal overstates things. So ask my fellow commissioners, do others agree that average is the right methodology versus marginal? All right, I see nods on that. So you've got most of what you want. Now we'll get on to the recs, and I'll let you return to your presentation on that, and we'll just focus on that.
Yeah, and thank you for laying those two aspects out. And I think the discussion about recs is largely about communication challenges, because if we have hourly and no one else has hourly, and the state doesn't have hourly, and we have our own accounting, that is going to be a communications challenge. So we can be more accurate and still appear to be emitting carbon.
But I just want to say that we're part of, our leadership is part of what caused the dilemma in the first place. So given that our language caused people to claim things on an annual basis, I kind of think we owe it to everybody to be leaders and be more accurate.
Yeah, noted.
Well, as we start to discuss communication challenges, I think it would be useful to sort of ask ourselves what we're trying to achieve as we communicate. Are we trying to cast the utility in the most positive light to give ourselves a big pat on the back? Or are we trying to let sophisticated customers understand what's really happening? Or are we trying to help customers make smart individual choices, which, is back to marginal emissions and, sort of a whole different, so I think that the communications challenge has a lot of complexity. And I wanted to put that in there as we start discussing it, the sort of like, what are our goals even with communication? Like, do we want to be able to say, we're 100% this or that? I've certainly noticed that even in our own, I've heard 2 mayors refer to us as 100% renewable. So it's hard to capture all the nuance of what the utility is trying to do.
Right, and if I was actually hoping there would be a question, as the last 2 of you has posed, and one thing I just want to put forth here is, what are our goals? Are they to ensure that every customer, every time they flip on the light switch, are provided with only carbon-free electricity? So that would be sort of Palo Alto as an island. Is it to use the resources that we have to the maximum benefit of, say, the ISO grid? Or is it to use to offset the most emissions possible for the ISO, California ISO grid? Or is it to use the resources we have to the maximum benefit of the Western Interconnect, which still has coal on it? So a unbundled or bucket 3 REC could be helping to put a coal plant, make it less economical relative to wind, and actually be offsetting more carbon, even though it's cheaper than an in-state REC, right? And so I think that framing, whatever the decision is from this body and council and the community, can help us with that, whichever is more important. And that is, I don't know if that helps at all, but in terms of this unbundled REC discussion.
That was a very effective way to state it. Thank you. What was the thinking in CEC to exclude unbundled RECs?
Well, I think there was concern about confusion to customers that every time they turned on the light switch, it was not 100% carbon-free power just because a CCA or a Palo Alto is 100% carbon-free. So there's definitely that confusion aspect. And I think that some of the investor-owned utilities that have contracts with natural gas and others and have scale larger than the CCAs and say munis, were concerned that the carbon emissions were not being appropriately communicated and attributed to those customers. So they wanted some mechanism. They couldn't change the RPS compliance things. That was legislation. They can't change it willy-nilly every time a interpretation of guidelines comes through. But in terms of communicating that there is some carbon associated with imports, essentially, which is these are unspecified market purchases, that they're not totally greened up when they're on a real-time basis.
And I just want to say, I don't think it's like a matter of, lobbying. I think it's that what basically is, at our first meeting, okay, that we went to 4 years ago, when we brought this up, one of the other commissioners told us, I asked what the storage strategy was, and this other commissioner said to me, well, we think of PG&E as our battery. And I think that what Palo Alto and the CCAs who are claiming to sell 100% green energy without having things like geothermal in their portfolio are basically painting this as the demon and then relying on PG&E and other entities to actually provide the electrons at night. And I think, if we're making responsible decisions as people who care about our environment, then that is why we need to support that, not because because they're just shilling for PG&E or something. I think that, that's really the, if we really want to tackle this problem as a society, then we need to know what we're dealing with. And so I just wanted to comment on that.
So as I see it, we're going to buy offsets for when that's the city policy, for when we're not using clean energy. And the question there is, does it matter whether the offsets come from Wyoming or California? We don't have a effective border for the atmosphere, so I'm in favor of using unbundled, but want to ask for commissioner views on that.
Well, I had a question about what is the CEC looking at as a qualifying rec? I mean, what, if they won't accept what you call bucket 3 recs, what is acceptable?
Bucket 1 recs will definitely still appear carbon neutral.
Could you clarify?
So that is projects that are connected to the ISO and scheduled in and bid into the ISO. So when those projects show up, they actually back down natural gas generators. Bucket 2 are like strips of power imports to the ISO, and so they're firmed and shaped. They may or may not have carbon associated with them. So and the difference in price is bucket 1 recs are about $22 per megawatt hour. Bucket 2 recs are around $9 per megawatt hour, and bucket 3 recs are at around $1.50 per megawatt hour. So, and offsets are separate, and they are about, I think if you convert them into megawatt hour, I think they're about the cost of bucket 2. They're kind of in the middle on a dollars per ton of carbon basis.
So if instead of buying RECs, would the REC purchases cover a geothermal baseload supply?
And so this is when it gets into portfolio rebalancing. So if you think about the framing, do we want to use resources to try to essentially offset carbon throughout the Western Interconnect, which still has a lot of coal, and some studies say that will have a higher, currently have a higher dollars per ton of carbon avoided impact, actually, in that bucket 3 recs. So if that's the largest, the ISO for the state would be to use bucket 1 recs, so still that market construct, but spur more renewable generation from in-state. And then the kind of furthest iteration for matching every electron that arrives to Palo Alto. So Palo Alto as an island, every electron that arrives is carbon free. That would be portfolio rebalancing, where we essentially buy baseload renewables, and those are also essentially gradated in price. So that would be kind of a platinum portfolio, the most expensive option. Or we could look at solar with storage, which we're evaluating right now. And so your question is, I think, yes, supply funds could pay for a baseload renewable resource or solar with storage type resource, but we would sell we would have to get rid of some of our existing contracts to do that. And it would be substantially more expensive than using the market constructs of either in-state recs or out-of-state recs.
And so when we sell off solar, because we have too much, do we sell the RECs with it, or do we try to hang on to the RECs and just put the energy into the market?
We hold on to the RECs, and the energy goes into the market, but all projects are going into the market. And so those solar resources have already backed down a natural gas generator. That's kind of the difference between these in-state and out-of-state. Because they were bid in, if a natural gas generator couldn't compete, it didn't run in the middle of the day, and so that was carbon actually displaced. So there's a difference between that bucket one rec really, showing up, being scheduled in, being bid against other resources, and causing less carbon to be emitted, even if it's for that period of time, versus a bucket three rec that is potentially bought at the end of a year, from a wind developer in Wyoming, which it didn't have any correlation with time or generation.
I just want to note there's also maybe 3 phases to this discussion. I want Lena or Jim to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think we're having this discussion as informational and educational tonight, and then the next discussion is about what it would actually mean if we were to adopt hourly accounting as a standard, and then the next discussion is how do we, now that we know what our standards are, what is the most cost-effective rebalanced portfolio that we could put in place given these new policies that we have, and that would be later in the year. So there would be there are no immediate changes based on, there are 3 discussions to be had, and I think a lot of this discussion about whether we would sell off solar and buy geothermal or sell it off and buy, northwest or southwest, southwest wind, what's the most complementary and most cost-effective way to achieve these low carbon objectives, that's going to be the 3rd discussion, am I right?
Yeah, the second and third, we might try to combine them a little bit,
Yeah.
but.
I mean, you have to talk about all of them at the same time to some extent.
We definitely anticipated wanting to go all the way in this discussion, and there's just, if we commit to hourly accounting, it is narrowing our options to some extent, as well as increasing the amount of either RECs or additional renewable generation that we would need to procure in order to match on an hourly basis.
The councilman, our liaison, a question. What's your sense in the discussions in the city council in terms of the trade-off between, being able to have high claims about being green versus the cost and keeping the cost of it? Because I've heard, both priorities from council members over the years, but there really are sometimes some competing things. So do you have any sense that you can share with us on how the discussions have gone?
I think you summarized it pretty well. I think it's very complicated, and you're going to hear both positions, and it's really, I think, a level of what understanding there is. And so I think the communication challenge is almost a separate issue that we should talk about.
And we'll be sensitive to this dynamic. I mean, we're not going to put you in a position where you say, hey, let's adopt hourly accounting, and then we come back and say, okay, now we're going to impose these huge costs on the city of Palo Alto. It's a phased discussion, but we can go back and recycle on the discussion, as we need to. So
It sounds to me like you're preparing to do this, but having price tags on these options, as you've already started to lay out, is really going to be important, I think, because there is the push and pull of cost-effective and being able to say that we're carbon-free.
And I can tell you, we have that in mind. We've already run some initial models. We have some initial ideas about the price tags, but nothing we're really ready to share with the UAC yet, that's all.
Lauren, do you have further comments or questions?
I think they've mostly been covered. I was also concerned about the economics and going to hourly, how much that's going to impact. You just, said lack of flexibility, but also on the economic side.
Yeah, and one thing, I understand that because the renewable energy certificates are a market construct, they don't feel as physical as knowing that, our supply is carbon-free every minute of every day, let alone hourly. But what is unique about California is because of the cap and trade system, the marginal price of electricity is correlated with the carbon. So the last unit to come online in California sets the price for that 5-minute interval. And because the price of carbon is in that price of generation, it means that by dispatching our hydro, which we have to for the maximum value, we're actually dispatching the hydro to displace the most carbon. And that's the one thing I really wanted to show in this heat map. So we have 3 heat maps here, and the scale is on the left in pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, from 0 to 1100. It's washed out on the screen, but the important things for the average 2018, these are actual emissions on a month across the top, and 24-hour along the y-axis, so like 12 by 24. Basically in the spring, midday, they're very green. Maybe you can see it better in your printout. So spring, midday, very green for average emissions, and then marginal in the summer afternoon and evening hours is when those really dirty, really carbon emitting and other emitting natural gas plants show up. And the point I want to, so in terms of where this is, where the emissions correlate to price, it's that middle chart there in those red hours. Those are the highest price hours as well as the highest emission hours. And you can see in the third chart, which is different scale, different type of chart, this is when we are long in green for our resources versus load, and when we are short in red. And those evening summer hours, we are very long because we are doing that on purpose to maximize the value of our hydro resources. And by generating the most revenue from those hydro resources, we're also displacing the most carbon. And so then just to overlay that, so they're really showing up. To overlay that, you can kind of see how those big green bars line up pretty well along the like June, July, August, 7 to 10 p.m. range. And so, in the ISO, where you have a cost of carbon baked into this, these are correlated, So we are using the market to do what it's meant to do, and our hydro resources, even though they cause us to be long on a seasonal basis, are actually displacing a lot of carbon in the worst hours of the carbon intensity of the grid.
Just at the risk of over-explaining, I mean, if you look at slide 7, if you look at slide 7, the bottom right-hand chart, a July typical day, there may be some temptation to say our load at night or in the morning is short. Why don't we take some of that hydro and redispatch it so that the electrons are all green coming to Palo Alto? What Lena just explained is why we don't do that. And there's a very good reason for it. It's better for the environment, and it's better for our pocketbooks to leave those hours open.
And as we follow this, marginal price signal, which is also the marginal emission signal, the price of carbon is actually increasing over time in the price signal. So it's actually, correlated and becoming more correlated over time. Following the price will be more closely aligned with following the carbon over time, as the price of carbon elevates.
Well, just to respond to a couple of questions that you've put along the way, personally, I very much favored thinking of our emissions in the context of the Western Interconnect, or at least the CAISO, but certainly not trying to think of Palo Alto as an island. I used to be quite wary of unbundled RECs because I figured if they were more than $20 a megawatt hour, there must be something, I figured that bundled RECs must be better since they cost 20 times as much. And I'm very interested if you've got studies that show that you're actually displacing more. I would love to see that. I corresponded an email with Jim, and he was also helping educate me, because it feels like there's actually an opportunity to not have to make a hard trade-off. If we're actually displacing more carbon at a much lower price point, that certainly is for me, worth learning a lot more about. I forget my other comments, so I'm going to stop there.
And to that point, I'm really interested in those studies, and we have worked with Watt Time, which is a subsidiary of RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, and they and I have some friends at NREL and been looking through the literature, and so to understand, it's really all about attribution. So whether that Wyoming wind farm would have shown up there without the unbuilt RECs or not. So if it's additive, if this is causing additional development, then.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll look into that because we are interested as well.
And I remembered my other question. For the typical January day, slide 7, lower left, can you explain the little 6 a.m. peaklet and 8 a.m. peaklet on the Calaveras? Those two little sawtooth jags? Especially given what you just said about dispatching hydro in the afternoon when it's both valuable and carbon displacing?
All right, so we're talking about January for Calaveras. This is probably following the LMP for Calaveras in January. What's LMP? Oh, sorry, locational marginal price. This is probably following the price signal because there's a morning peak and evening peak. Are you talking about the 6 to 9 a.m. two double spikes there for Calaveras?
Why does it dip at 7 a.m.?
Again, I think this is generated using actual dispatches for a month, averaged on a 24-hour basis. So I think I wouldn't read too much into that.
In January, the hydro dispatch gets complicated too because you have very low output and you may be tracking things like fish flows, and I mean we can get back to you with more information on that, but it's a small part of our portfolio. We'll take a look at it and get back to you.
And it really may be an artifact of averaging 30 days for a 24-hour period, but definitely worth looking at.
So I know we're going to discuss this, I guess, in our next session about the communication challenges, but just to kind of go back to the discussion you were having with Commissioner Forcell, being able to explain what we're getting when we buy an unbundled REC and what the ecological value of that is would be very important if our decision ultimately is to stick with the present policy of buying unbundled RECs.
Yeah, noted.
I'll add another comment in communications. In the corporate world, companies present their GAAP financials and sometimes non-GAAP financials as well. It's not that difficult. And Palo Alto can include whatever literature it wants. We're carbon neutral, and if we have to report both, we just say Palo Alto's methodology is to measure on an hourly basis and to buy renewable energy credits from throughout the Western, whatever. So I'm not too troubled by that. We'll be able to enable the mayors to say what they want on that.
Very accurately.
Yes. So this was intended to be a discussion. So any final comments?
So since I'm not going to be here in June because I'm going to be out of town, I just wanted to add about the communications piece of it, that I think that one can communicate these issues more simply without necessarily having everybody in town become an expert on bundled versus unbundled RECs. And I think that you can do a layering of how you explain concepts and do some things visually. So while we're not going to get into it now, I as somebody who spends a lot of time explaining pricing and various other complicated concepts, I just think it can be done. It can be done in a way that is accurate and accessible to people.
Yeah, and thank you for that, and I agree, and we will work on that. I think what we really want to target is how does the UAC and potentially council feel about these trade-offs, being able to brand ourselves as carbon-free every hour of every day, or show up carbon-free on the power content label, or not, or maximize, how economic our portfolio is.
Alina, I want to thank you. I want to thank Eric. I know he's on the phone. Jim, pardon me. Jim, and we'll look forward to the next discussion. It's actually noted on our rolling calendar for July, but maybe it's intended for June, and we'll look forward to that. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, please.
One more on the communication side. So I look at it as two pieces of it. One is how carbon emitting our portfolio is, but the other piece we haven't talked about, and it's just food for thought, is if part of the goal is to impact behavior, then we need to be, thoughtful about how to communicate that piece as well.
Absolutely.
We'll go on to the next agenda item, which is the gas utility financial plan and gas rates.
All right, so I'm going to invite Eric Keniston, our REITs manager, senior resource planner, to talk about the last of our series of rate discussions, the gas financial plan and our gas rate recommendations.
Good evening, Commissioners. So tonight, yes, it's the final in the series. Last you'll be seeing me for the gas utility financial plans and rate change proposals. So tonight, much of the preamble slides I think you've seen in prior evenings, so I can speed through them if you'd wish, but yes, this is the last. We're bringing, May is the final one for gas. We've already brought water, wastewater, and electric to you. And we are finishing up the gas, and we finished the water COSA. We are finishing up the gas COSA right now, and we'll be presenting that to you as soon as that is finalized. And we'll be doing a wastewater COSA next year, so that's the next in line for our COSA scheduling. All the observations and cost trends, I won't belabor it, but again, construction costs have been escalating. We've generally seen the natural gas market prices have been trending up, although I will say this month it dropped, so that's a pleasant twist. Transmission costs continue to increase, and the cost of environmental programs also continue to go up. And O&M costs are increasing by about 3 to 4% per year, salaries and benefits going up by about 13 to 24%. But our total bill still is lower than neighboring utilities. So here on the gas side, we've actually come down a little bit from what we were saying in the preliminary views. We were, it's a 1 percentage point lower. On the residential side, we're recommending an 8% rate increase on the gas side. And it's going to be slightly lower on the commercial side, about a 2 to 3% increase, and we can get into that discussion a little bit more on that. So for the gas, the cost structure here is about, if you look at it, about 65% of our costs are related to the distribution side of the house, and about half of that is really related to the O&M, the maintenance of the pipes in the grounds, about 14% related to capital investment. And the other side, we have the gas supply, and that, you notice they're all have asterisks next to them. All of those costs we currently push through as pass-through costs. So every month when we get a new bid week price from the market, we pass that through in the gas supply. Gas environmental costs, which include cap and trade, those types of things, we change those prices as we have to buy new allowances, and we adjust that based upon what the market is currently going for. The gas transmission costs, again, we pass that through directly from what PG&E's schedule is, and that changes about every 6 months or so. So of the rate increase that we're doing, it's a distribution rate increase. Gas is the one always a little bit of an exception to all the other utilities. When we talk about rate increases, we can talk about it in one of two ways. We change rates on the distribution side, and that is what we are discussing tonight. But again, because it's about 65% of the overall, when I say 8% rate increase on distribution, that will translate to about a 5% overall utility rate change when you add in supply and everything else. So of the distribution rate increase tonight, about 4.6% of that, a little bit more than half, is related to CIP expense increases that we're seeing. About 3% of it is related to O&M expenses, and a little bit is due to load loss, something that we have been seeing across all of our utilities, and we factored that into across everything, that we will be seeing a slow decline in usage over time. Gas supply main drivers, just general volatility of market. It's risen in recent years as supplies have become tighter and demand has increased. PG&E transmission rates are rising to fund safety improvements, and as PG&E raises their rates, gets passed on to us. Cap and trade costs continue to go up annually, and carbon neutral gas plan, that's currently actually saving us a little bit of money, so that's pleasant. Operation and capital cost drivers, again, we are getting back into resuming a regular rate of main replacement. It's going to be a staggered program, so we're going to, similar to what we're seeing in the water and wastewater, we're going to do every other year a larger main replacement project, and then have an off year, and then a large main replacement project. The goal of this will be to ideally get a better load of bids coming in for these projects, and hopefully keep our costs down over time. But underground construction costs have been going up. This one thing that we're also seeing is, as John mentioned earlier, temporary funding for the gas cross-bore program, which we expect to go on for about 3 years. And of course, health and retirement costs and associated overhead.
Are we having similar staffing problems, recruiting people for certain roles in the gas utility as well?
Generally, in the gas fund, we've been okay. I think the electric operations is the one we're having the most difficulty. Entry-level positions, we usually can find candidates. It's now more in the middle level and higher level management positions across funds that we are still recruiting for. But it is in a better situation than the electric operations.
So here we're showing a spread of utility bills, and what you notice here is that for the way that our rates are set up, we are generally lower on the residential side in the winter, and a little bit higher in some of the summer months. In overall, we tend to be lower on an annual bill basis than PG&E. On the commercial side, we're also, especially on the smaller end spectrum, we're favorable. A little bit higher when you get up into the high user, the G3 class.
Eric, why is that we're so much higher in the summer?
Why we're so much higher in the summer? It's just a function.
So much higher than PG&E.
Well, part of it.
63.4%.
Yeah, well, one, it's spread out, but two, we also, one of the things that makes us different from what PG&E has is we have a monthly customer charge that sits on top of our bills, whereas PG&E is mainly just volumetric on theirs. So that changes the equation a little bit in the curve.
Usage goes down in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
No higher things.
Yeah. So with the proposed rate increase, you can see this shows how the bills will vary between the two different periods. So yeah, gas bills for residential are going up by about 8%, like I said, and the commercial sector is going up by between 1.5 to 3%. And one of the things I should note on the commercial side, it looks like, if you look at the 5,000 and 10,000 range, that you see a little bit of it's almost neutral or a decrease. The majority of our commercial customers are actually below the 500 therm per month range. So most of our commercial customers see a bill increase.
I actually have a question for Catherine on this. Have you ever done any kind of study or test to see if you say to somebody it's going to go up $2 versus X percent, whether they have a different response? Because I think when you look at it and you go, okay, it's $2, it's like, okay, or $3, $8 or whatever. It doesn't feel like as much to me.
It's interesting you asked that question. We actually have that debate internally, and our Assistant Director of Customer Support Services is pretty vehement that the dollar amount is the best way to communicate to the customer that while the percentage may seem high, really, in reality, the way it pencils out is not a huge increase in terms of the money out of pocket. And if you think about it, $2, that can hardly buy you a cup of coffee these days, but yet $2 is enough to provide enough gas, for example, to heat your entire home, wash your clothes, dry your clothes, and so the value spread out over all of those actual uses, you could say it's a judgment, but it's quite a great investment in what you get.
You bring up, it's like, it's one load of laundry or something, but I think that I don't know, that just occurred to me as I was looking at this. It maybe might be a thing to test and see if you get a different reaction.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, and on that point, some utilities choose to not even show percentages and just show dollars. So, I've looking at many utilities and how they structure their communications, it ranges all over the board.
We appreciate you presenting both to us. So.
I just want to do a quick follow-up on Commissioner Johnson's question about the summer charge. So the fixed meter charge is about $13 a month, which is about 65% of that summer charge.
Thank you. So with that, that sort of ends my main body of my presentation. Like I said, 8% distribution rate increase, resulting in a 5% overall system rate increase. So supply costs will continue to vary as they do month by month. But again, the 5% assumes the way that we present it is because we don't know what the changes are going to be from month to month, we assume static for what it was last year. And as always, our goals are to bring rates in line with costs, use reserve to smooth rate increases, and to replenish and maintain reserve health over the forecast horizon. And so with that, we bring to you the gas recommendation, and I ask for any questions you may have.
Commissioners, questions?
I had a question on Table 2 in the report. I mean, you look at this, and it certainly looks like the residential customers, G1, are bearing the brunt of the rate increase. And I assume that's driven by the COSA.
It is, correct.
And I just don't know how much flexibility we might have, but this feels harsh to me to put this, to really put the residents, put the burden on the residents.
Yeah, actually, when we looked at the percentage of revenue that the COSA recommended we get from residential customers actually matches up with what our previous COSA back in 2012 states, which is about 42% of our distribution costs is what it recommended collecting. So unfortunately, with the residential group are the vast majority of our customers, and most of the distribution lines in the ground go to feed are related to them. They also are, in general, a peakier class. If you look at relative wintertime usage over average compared to all the other classes, they have a much higher spike and a higher demand related to the overall system, so it goes to feed them. So once you factor all those into the COSA, that's how it specs out for. But
I guess my question is how rigid is the COSA? In other words, does it say, it's 42% should be attributed to customers, not 42.5 or not 30? I just wonder if there's any flexibility.
We tried various different ways, and this was the most reasonable method that we found for everyone involved. So I'd say we looked to see if there was any other allocators that we could use or different ways that we could push, and this was just the most reasonable basis that we came up with. So,
I mean, I think the answer is, as far as there really isn't flexibility. If our attorneys were sitting here, they would say, we're not going to we shouldn't deviate from the cost of service study for defensibility purposes. One of the things that we do is we comb over, and this is one reason that it's taken a while to get the cost of service study to you, is that Eric has combed over every assumption there to make sure that there isn't something, some stray number or, assumption that maybe could be reasonably looked at in, a different way that that was maybe, maybe the wrong assumption was made. He's digging through every single piece of the model to make sure that there aren't major dislocations. In this case, to some extent, we may have under-forecasted we may have forecasted higher residential usage than we actually saw, and so we need to raise the rates to get them back in line.
And the other thing I saw was that we're shifting more of the monthly expense to the service charge as opposed to the volumetric.
Correct.
And, I read the explanation, but again, that seems harsh for relatively small users who are going to get a whopping big increase in the service charge, whereas somebody who, uses quite a bit more gas is not going to see a comparable increase.
Yes, unfortunately, the growth that we saw compared, again, from where the last COSA was, is that a lot of the growth came in on the customer service. A lot of the things that we normally attribute to the customer charge, those were where we saw a bigger hit of the costs growing. So that's why the recommendation to push more towards that side. I think, actually, if you look across all of our utilities, that would be a general recommendation that we'll probably be making going forward, even if we, on the electric side, when we start, maybe in the future, may move to having a customer charge there as well. It'll be we'll be suggesting we'll bring it in slowly, but, it's probably going to come in probably on the $10 range or something like that. So it's not totally outside of the realm of what we're seeing across even the water side as well, but, yeah.
And is that because it costs the utility as much to kind of deal with individual customers as it does larger customers?
Yeah, because, the costs go up, but we don't really have that much in the way of customer growth. We're not putting in a lot of new services, so as it grows, that larger cost over a relatively fixed number of units, it just makes that number grow fast. So, and there is also a certain distribution component to it as well, which, as that grows, and over fewer, we end up pushing some to there as well.
I think that there's also an implication for this in terms of an electrification push of residential, because if only people with large lots can afford to convert to heat pumps, and so you now have fewer people living in smaller houses who have gas heating, either can't afford to do the conversion or would find that if they went to electric heat, their bills would go up. You're now going to be pushing more fixed costs onto smaller numbers of people who won't be able to pay as much, but yet the cost of service, it's going to go up and the fixed charges are going to be higher. So, I think when we do the analysis of what does it mean to do electrification at the residential level, that what you're talking about needs to be included in that conversation.
Absolutely, and that is on our minds in the decarbonization discussion.
Just a quick question. I had been planning to ask of the gas environmental, the 6% slice of the pie on slide 7, how much of that was the carbon neutral gas plan? And then you mentioned that it's primarily cap and trade, and then you said the carbon neutral gas plan is even saving the utility money. Can you explain that?
Well, I'd say perhaps I misspoke a little bit.
Did I hear that right?
It's possible I misspoke a little bit.
Then let's do more of it.
Yes. So we, I'd say, and I did misspeak on that, the gas prepay option that we have is actually saving us money on the gas supply side. But the gas environmental, yes, is primarily, that's cap and trade related programs. And so, yeah, that's about how much we look at.
So then I'll ask my original question. How much is the carbon neutral gas plan?
How much is it currently?
Is the, yeah, of that 2.4 million or that 6%?
I do not know the number off the top of my head, but I will look it up and get back to you on that.
Lisa, I think it's part of the gas
1.5?
supply cost.
1.5 million. Thank you, Dave.
And is that accounted for under gas environmental, or is that accounted under gas supply?
That'd be under, that'd be under environmental.
Okay.
Correct, yeah.
No, so it's more than half of gas environmental?
Correct.
Okay.
Sorry, was that the 1.5 million?
Yes, yes.
We want to bring up actual costs. We give ourselves room for procurement, so 1.5 million may not be the actual cost. Dave's looking that up. So it may actually be less than half of the environmental costs.
Okay.
So stay tuned, still stay tuned.
Stay tuned, okay.
Any more discussion or questions on this item? We've been asked to recommend approval of this. Is there, you want to put the resolution up again on the screen? Is there a motion in favor of the resolution, to pass the resolution?
I move we adopt the resolution as stated, the recommendation.
Any seconds? Second, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, passes.
I'll just add that I really would hope that we look for ways in the future to try to ameliorate the burden on the residential customers and low-volume customers. And
I would agree, and Jonathan is correct. We can't really change the COSA. We make sure that the methodology is actually very similar to what we do both between prior COSAs, consistency, as well as what we do in our other utilities as well. So it's not like we have a lot of room to make changes.
I understand that our hands are pretty well tied, but whatever we can do.
But
So
over
that
the
might
long
be a
term,
place.
over the long term, we will look for, cost control measures. I mean, Eric mentioned the prepay, gas prepay deal that we put in this year. We also look at rate assistance for those who struggle to afford it. So we do have that option in place. Thinking about how to, make people more aware of that. And then more generally, just trying to look at our rate structures and always continue over the future to see if there are any opportunities. But I will point out that our rates are still very competitive with PG&E or lower than, and that's one way that we serve our residents and our lower using customers well.
As I understand it, though, the one challenge which I think is possibly what Commissioner Johnson is struggling with, but you can say, is that there's this inverse impact. So those who are most conservative focused are actually punished for that in a sense, because the proportion of their bill that has nothing to do with how much they conserve goes up as they conserve more. And if there's some way to reward those efforts, since that's what we've been talking about this entire evening, even creative ways within whatever the legal limitations are, that would be great.
So one of the things that came up at the Low-Income Energy Issues Forum is that a lot of utilities are shifting to the phrase income qualified because it feels less pejorative or whatever. And so maybe our assistance program could be remodeled as income qualified, because I got to believe that in Palo Alto, a fairly high income would qualify for hardship support. So maybe that might be a way to remove some of the stigma and get some assistance if you have to do the because the fixed charges, and that's the argument against demand charges as well in electricity, is that if you spread the the proportional costs or do whatever. That's just one of the ways that you have to look at it anyway. But so I just offer that as an idea.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to the budget now. Had enough fun raising rates, now I want to spend money, so.
And so the carbon offset for FY18 was 1.3 million.
So not as low as I thought.
All right, tonight with us is Anna Vong, Senior Business Analyst. She will be presenting the budget.
So Anna, as you put the slides up, let's focus on the critical items and points on the slides that you want to emphasize. We don't need to mention every line in that.
And this is the more condensed version. Previously, I think we had 40 slides for you, but we tried to cut it down like 15. There's a lot more graphics too. She made it a lot prettier.
All right, good evening, Commissioners, Council Member. We'll be walking us through the fiscal year 2020 proposed budget for capital and operating. Had wanted to take a quick look at our quick recap of our fiscal year 19 accomplishments, but if you wanted to move forward. Just to bring the mic a little. Oh, sure. Yes. Is it okay if I go through those accomplishments? Okay, yes, just not everyone, right.
We all read the accomplishments, so we don't need to talk about those.
Okay. Oh, right, sorry. This keyboard. All right, okay. So you are aware of all our accomplishments and the awards that we've received. Just gonna go ahead and skip on through to the key performance indicators then. If I could start from the bottom left to the to go clockwise, we have cleaned over 61 sewer, 61. Oh, this is not the same slide. Oh, right. Well, we have cleaned over 61, we have received over 61 sewer sanitary overflows. That is a reduction from a prior year. We have achieved 12% reduction from the previous year. We follow our sanitary sewer maintenance plan. I kind of skip onto the top where the 75 sewer mile lines that were cleaned and flushed. We have an aggressive schedule where we clean the entire city over a 4-year period. And it helps to reduce the sanitary sewer overflows. We've replaced over 65 utility wood poles, and where we can, we're going to increase the footage of the poles by 5 feet to accommodate for future fiber and wireless communications. And we have achieved 92% compliance for our backflow devices. For our electric customer outage, we've experienced about 70 minutes per average outage per duration for customer. We've exceeded a little bit by our target. And for my slide actually has have achieved the gas efficiency savings by 316,000 therms. I also wanted to state that we had surpassed the state goal of 50% of achieving 50% of RPS savings by 2030. We've repaired 90 gas leaks, and this is also an aggressive schedule. We have a 2-year walking mobile survey that surveys the entire city, walking survey, and then every year it's a mobile survey. So that brings us to a total residential bill that averages 12% lower. This 12% calculation uses our current rate compared to our upcoming rate with the current neighboring cities' rates. So the average could increase a little bit more. And that leads to our overall 86% customer satisfaction rate.
subsequent slides, so just,
Okay,
unless the commissioners on that, we'll skip that slide.
I'm sorry, we want to skip
We'll skip that slide, I think.
this one? Okay, so for, this is, sorry, there's some technical changes. This should say proposed fiscal year 20 budget, it's $317 million. Majority of that, about 46% of that's utility purchases, then CIP, and then salaries and benefits. Do you have any questions for me on this slide?
When you say utility purchase, that's commodity purchase, right?
That's correct, yes. This pie chart is the total 5-year fund, 5 funds.
And so the debt service is paid to whom?
The debt services is the,
Service and rent, so it's rent for the facilities and also debt for, sorry.
bond repayments for prior years.
Right, so bond reissuance payments, and also for the Central Valley project, I think that's about a $9 million debt service. And then I think the facilities rent's about $10 million overall for the entire city, for all the utility infrastructures. I think it increased like 3.9% over last year.
Okay.
So budget highlights, ongoing costs, salaries and benefits. It's going up about 12% or $5.4 million. This is due to the recently approved SEIU and UMPAPA contracts. And there's also about 3% of that increase is attributed to the proactive pension funding. Our commodity costs increased about 6%. I think Eric has talked about that already. And these ongoing costs includes the reclass of the assistant city manager and utilities general manager position back to utilities general manager or director. There's also a power engineer to electric power project engineer class reclass. And then there's the resource management division reorg. The resource management division reorganization includes a couple of positions that are being reclassed. We're reclassing them so that we can reassign staff from resource supply to program services to promote the new carbon reducing technologies, such as EVs, space and water heat pumps, energy storage. And our one-time operating costs, Alto Court, we have leased this space for engineering staff for over 20 years now, and we have had minor improvements to that location, but it's not ADA compliant, and all the space needs a little updating. And then next we have our cross-sport safety program. We're entering phase 2 of the program, and it's a 3-year project. It addresses the remaining laterals that were not inspected. Funding is about $1 million per year, and we recently issued the IFB, and we're currently evaluating the responses, and staff should we expect to bring the staff report to council before they go on break, so we can start construction on that. The electric overhead maintenance contract is $1.5 million annually. This is to address the backlog of maintenance on the electric overhead lines due to limited staffing resources. But we've made progress on the alignment front on hiring, so hopefully we can ease back on that a little bit. Right. Any questions on this one? Okay. So our overall capital improvement budget for the 5 funds is $49.6 million, 20 for electric, about 16 for water, 3.7 for gas, 1.5 for fiber, and about $8 million for wastewater. Initiatives for this fiscal year, or this coming fiscal year, Eric mentioned the gas and wastewater cost of service study. We're looking to launch a program for EV charger installations. We'll continue on collaborating with Public Works on the recycled water strategic plan. There's a fiber AMI design where we'll be looking to engage with a consultant to do a business plan for the fiber to the node, fiber to the premise. And then from the capital improvement side, we have our Colorado Power Station upgrade. So water main replacement project 27. We'll be repairing an old transmission at the Old Page Mill Road by 280. The Corte Madera Reservoir replacement, sanitary sewer project 28B. And we'll be extending fiber from Dahl to Montebello Reservoir. So the next set of slides, so this is a overall 8% increase for overall 8% rate increase. Our revenues are 169 million for the electric fund. That's an increase of 10 million. Our expenses, 182 million. Our operations, 32 million. And then for the CIP, it's 20 million. That includes the Caltrain modernization and underground rebuilds and substation improvements.
Do you guys want to pause during each of these utilities and ask questions, or wait till the end? What do you prefer? Okay.
All right. So for fiber fund, pretty straightforward. We have the consumer price index increase for 4.5% for the EDF1. No revenue change, still 4.5 million. Our expenses is 4 million, very slight increase. Our reserves are sitting at 33 million, and the CIP projects we have 1.5 million. And that includes that Dahl Montebello project I spoke of.
So reserves are about 5 or 6 times annual revenues?
Correct. Yeah, it's been growing roughly in the past 4 million a year. Now it's more 2 million as we do more capital improvement projects. Yeah, revenue annually is about 4.5 million a year.
I also had one question, which is kind of a nit, but for the number of employees in fiber, it looked like half the employees are customer service. And I don't know, is that because you allocate customer service across the utility, or are they actually fiber customer service employees?
I think we allocated a proportion of our customer service staff to fiber just because it's a complicated billing. They have to manually bill each of those customers. So a percentage of their time is set aside. But that customer service should also include operations staff, I think, as well.
I'm sorry, what staff? I didn't hear.
It should also include the operations and engineering staff as well.
For fiber.
Where are you seeing that number, if you don't mind?
I can find it. It's on the back in the...
Can I ask a quick question? So I see other cities increasing their fiber revenues. Like, why is ours flat year to year on the revenue side?
Sorry, one more time.
Why is the revenue in the fiber area flat kind of year to year?
We actually haven't been gaining new customers. And if anything, we've lost a couple of customers lately. One of our larger resellers was sold out just last year. So just because we haven't gotten more customers than connected than disconnected. And the rates haven't really changed. The only rates that have changed are the EDF1 rates for the pre-2006 customers, and that goes up by CPI increase. And that's about 50% of the revenue. I think the increase is like $60,000 for those customers.
Should I continue while we look for the fiber number? Okay. For the gas fund, it's an overall 5% increase to our rates. Revenues, 49 million. Expenses, 44 million. That's a slight increase of 0.9. And operations reserves at 19 million.
But I have a quick question on this one too. So revenue exceeded expenses. How come the reserves didn't go up instead of down?
Yes.
Should that be a plus 5 million?
I don't think so.
Revenue should have been 39 million instead of 49 million. It was misstated on the slide.
Okay,
And expenses are 44 million.
thanks.
And for our capital improvement projects, 3.7 million. As Eric had mentioned earlier, we are doing every other main replacement projects every other year. We're accommodating for the larger projects in 1 year and then taking a break next year or the following year. For wastewater, it's overall rate increase of 7%. Costs increase are due to wastewater treatment plant upgrades. Revenues are 23 million, an increase of 1.3 million. Expenses is 27 million, an increase of 2.8 million. And our operations reserves are at 4 million. And that's within range and at target level.
So can I just understand this? So I thought we'd been trying to bump up the reserves and build them back up. So is it just that we're still below the levels, or we haven't increased them at all? Maybe I'm not understanding the number correctly.
For the wastewater? For
Just
all
in
of them?
general.
Yes, thanks.
So a lot of what we've been talking about with the rate and financial plan presentations is prospective, and what you're seeing is retrospective, and it's the reason that we are trying to build back reserves back up, because they've been decreasing.
Thought we had, over the last couple of years, tried to do something about it, but it doesn't seem like it's had much impact.
It depends on the fund. Let's see. We're going to see if we might have to dig out some of the, it depends on the fund, and I can't say off the top of my head which funds were struggling with reserve levels and which were not. I think the gas fund and the water fund were doing okay. The wastewater fund was scraping the bottom, and the electric fund was especially having trouble. But I'd have to go back and take a look at the individual reserve levels.
Are the figures on page 81 and 82 of the big fat budget report the relevant ones for talking about reserves? I was comparing the third column, the projected ending balance, against the fourth column, fiscal year 2020 reserve guideline range. Is that the place to look to see if the ending balance is inside the range? Then we're sort of okay?
Yes, that's correct.
But it does look like we're drawing down all of the reserves. I mean, in each of the funds.
Yeah, and the increases we have approved for the rates in the last couple of months will help bring those back up.
Right, but the budget shows them going down for the year. I mean, the budget shows expenses exceeding revenues in all the funds except the fiber.
Oh.
Yeah, if we didn't draw down on the reserves, the rate impacts would have been even higher this year. So we tried to use that to smooth out the rate increases. We had sufficient reserves to draw down on this year.
It does look like for the utility funds, the reserves all remain within the guidelines.
That's correct. We
Yeah.
tried to stay within them.
I can also say, as far as the rate projections versus the budget projections, we take into account that the budget isn't 100% spent every year, and so there, with the electric fund, I mean, we can go through each of the reserves. With the electric fund, we have some reserve transfers into the operations reserve that are planned that are going to take care of keeping the operations reserve at the same level. Within the gas fund, you can see the reserves are increasing. Within the wastewater collection,
Jonathan, pardon me, which page are you on?
81 and 82.
My numbers.
Go to the beginning, it's got lower numbers.
Oh, okay, got it, all right.
There's like a big jump to 400.
Yeah.
Sorry, when I earlier made a claim that, oh, if you look at column 3, it looks like we're within range for all the utility funds. I missed the parentheses, which is a big miss. But like if we look at the gas fund, am I interpreting this correctly that it's negative $7 million projected ending balance?
You want to look at the operations reserve rather than the total.
Oh, just the operations reserve.
That's right.
Okay. Will we at some point talk about the pension reserve and the OPEB reserve and what they are and why they're huge negative numbers?
Would you like to? This is actually, Commissioner Siegel actually got ahead of you by about 2 weeks with an email question. So thankfully, because it took a little, we had to do a little, had to have a few discussions with our accountants to fully understand these. But I think the essence of both of these reserves is that they represent the unfunded pension and other benefit liability for retirees. It's not exactly that number for a variety of reasons. It took us a while to get through. There are some costs that are amortized over several years, so it doesn't exactly equal that, but it's pretty close. You could think about it for all intents and purposes. So there is a discussion to be had, I think, at a future UAC about, and actually this is a citywide discussion that's taking place right now, about, number one, the assumptions that are being made about the size of that liability, whether assumptions about discount rates that are being used to assess that liability level, for example, and then whether the amount that we're contributing is increasing or decreasing that level over time. And that's going to require a little more analysis, and I'm thinking about Dave and I will have to talk about this, but we're thinking about a future, maybe fall date to have a broader discussion about that. And I don't think we want to get too far ahead of the council on the discussions they're having. But yeah, it's an important thing for us to talk about. And the one thing I will just say about that is that the issues that you'll have in these utilities is different from the issues that you'll have in the general fund, because salaries are a much lower percentage of overall costs than they are in the general fund.
And I think I found Commissioner Siegel's question earlier about customer service in the fiber fund. It looks like it's increasing year over year more than prior years because they're putting the extra contribution for these unfunded liabilities in that customer center grouping instead of distributing it across all the different divisions. That's why there seems to be a spike across all the funds. So we'll work with the county, having them spread that out more appropriately.
The water fund has an overall rate increase of 1%. Revenues are at $50 million. It's an increase of $4.3 million.
Oh, you got to get a little closer to the microphone, maybe.
Sorry. Revenues are $50 million, an increase of $4.3 million, and expenses are at $59 million. It's an increase of 0.3. Our operations reserves at $34 million. Our year over year, it's a decrease of 9.7. And a capital improvement, we have 16 million programmed for the year. It includes the water main replacement, 27, and the water tank seismic system upgrades, including some annual recurring projects as well.
I'm sorry to belabor operations reserves, but now I'm just looking at the difference between the slide on the electric fund and page 81, and noticing that they're quite different. So slide 9 has the operations reserve at 32 million, or a $14 million drawdown.
So for that one, we're looking at operations plus hydro. That's the only one. It's a we're adding
okay.
operation. Sorry.
So does adding hydro back in make it be within the guideline range?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Our workforce measures, our progress. In January, we came to the UAC and, since we last updated you guys in January, the number of vacancies has decreased by about 30%, from 44 positions to 31 positions. This has been helped by we've been proactively working with HR on recruiting strategies, as well as attending local trades and colleges, to trade schools and colleges and high school job fairs to get their name out there and our postings. And I think the latest SEIU contract will help us tremendously with the increase in the various electric operations classifications.
Any questions on this slide?
No, thank you. That's good news on the hiring.
Thank you for all your hard work as well.
Can I, just a quick question on the new SEIU contract. Was that all in the works the last time when we talked about workforce?
No, we did not know about it. It was under closed sessions. It was in the works. It was in progress, but it was.
But it was not public knowledge?
No.
Okay.
And here's our technology roadmap. I think you guys are familiar with this alphabet soup. We're currently working on the My Utilities account, the customer portal. And this will provide us with our customers with a new user interface and with more account detail, as well as more payment options. Beginning this year, we'll kick off the advanced metering infrastructure business plan, and the geographical information system, and the ERP technical upgrade.
I thought the CIS had to be done first, and that's why you were holding up AMI.
There's been a change in plans recently. So the city's going to upgrade the ERP system first now. They said that one's out of support, and that is a higher priority. So the CIS is going to get bumped out for another 3-4 years. So we're looking into moving the AMI project up in advance a couple years now. So moving ahead of the CIS. So that's good news, I think. But we're still working out the details before we publicize it all.
And I
Well,
certainly,
we just did.
well, certainly a lot of the planning can happen, in parallel, so that's good news.
Yeah, the main difference is we're not going to be integrating with our SAP system. We'll integrate with the new CIS system when it comes on board, comes live.
And this is the utility strategic plan that we've been working on in the past year. We've implemented several of the tasks listed here, and I think it's kind of shows in our key performance measures, as well as our accomplishments for the year. Okay, comes to the recommendation page. Yes.
Sorry, I still had a couple other
Yes.
questions before we recommend. And going back to broadband, sorry I couldn't find this before, but on page 406, I believe it is, yeah, there's a comment, the second bullet says that develop a plan to ensure the retention of commercial dark fiber customers due to anticipated changes in the market for business broadband. And I'm wondering what that is and what that means, because I thought I saw, which I can't find now, that there is a slight decrease in the broadband customers, and we just put all this money into improving it, and I'm wondering if those are connected and what it is.
So I think this bullet's more about trying to retain our customers as Comcast, AT&T are upgrading their networks. So making sure we provide the customer service that they're seeking and trying to prevent them from turning over, retaining them, I guess. But we're still trying to figure out strategies to retain and attract new commercial customers.
So that slight decrease that I thought I saw, that's because there's more competitive offerings from Comcast and AT&T?
That slight decrease was a one-time. It was a reseller that got acquired by another company who did not need to use our fiber. They had their own fiber.
So, Commissioners, I'm wondering if we, just a question for you on process, if we want to talk about each of these funds individually and ask questions beginning with the electric fund, is that a good way to proceed, or people have other suggestions? Or you were about to ask something?
I was going to ask a question about the electric fund that I skipped over earlier, but way back on page 75 of the big memo, when it's talking about increases in rates in the electric fund, one of the reasons for increasing rates is new renewable projects coming online. And I just wonder, are we displacing cheap power with more expensive renewable power?
That's maybe been the story leading up until I think to a large extent, most of that changeover from gas, from less expensive fracked gas to more expensive renewable power wrapped up around 2018. There is one more contract coming online, but that's largely going to be offset by the expiration of other contracts. So that shift has largely taken place already.
So why are we justifying the rate increase on that basis?
So if we can, I'd love to be able to go back to the chart that we showed last month with the electric fund that breaks down the reasons for the rate increase. Part of the justification for the increase is that revenues have not yet caught up to that cost increase, so that's part of it. Another significant part is an increase in capital investment. And then the last small piece has to do with some load decreases due to, a large data center, for example, moving out of the city. So we may not have, there may be some wording to update there. But yeah, there's a little lag in catching the revenues up to that cost increase. Oh, sorry, transmission cost increases. That's the other major driver for the electric fund.
Yeah, I understand that. I think if it's not the case that the new renewable contracts are displacing cheaper power, I would take that out because I think people look at it and go, oh.
Yes, absolutely. No, the point's well taken.
Let's go over to the electric fund then, and there are several principal components. There's cost of procurement. We didn't have any major decisions on that for this year, though coming up with the water contracts in a year or two for hydro, we may. Operations costs, we didn't really have decisions for the UAC other than to encourage paying competitive wages, and there's been progress in that point of view. So I guess the question I would ask Jonathan Davis, what big decisions were there about what to put in and what to take, or not to put in the initiatives that have a big budget impact? And I'm at page 392 on your chart, your handout. So some of these don't have big budget impact, but I'm talking about what initiatives did we leave out or did we put in that were subject of discussion? And
I think most of these are current initiatives that we're carrying over. The biggest one that's a new part is the EV adoption to meet the SCAP goals. And the other one is the Colorado Station upgrade, replacing the transformers and all the equipment, auxiliary equipment.
I would say other initiatives that have budget impact, we just wrapped up a discussion about considering rebalancing the electric portfolio, and depending on the decisions that we make around that, it could have either an increased budget impact or a budget savings, depending on the route we choose. We have a number of sustainability and efficiency measures in here, and one of the things that we're working on right now is understanding, trying to assign more metrics to the efficiency programs that we're working on to make sure that we're focused on the most effective and cost-effective programs. So that's another one with budget impact.
And how are you approaching that?
We'll be able to have a more in-depth discussion. I couldn't speak to that off the top of my head. We'll have a more in-depth discussion about that coming up later this summer.
So if I were to rephrase my question, what are the discretionary choices that were made in this budget?
That would depend on perspective, I guess. Renewables, energy efficiency, like the CIPs, I don't know if it's really discretionary because the equipment is aging. We could defer some of the projects, but there are risks involved.
On the CIP, also, anything that was deferred as part of the
Correct.
decision.
Yes. Anything that was deferred was added into this budget that we couldn't complete this year. So we estimate what will get done this year with this current year's CIPs, and what we don't think we can finish, we'll defer it to next year's budget already.
And is there anything that otherwise would have been in next year's that is being pushed out because of budgetary constraints?
I'll defer that again. Do you know? Yeah, we do, but that's, what? Okay, you can tell them that. Which ones?
You want to restrict this to the electric utility specifically, go through this utility by utility, or are you looking broadly?
One fund at a time.
Yeah, no, that's
And we also have a comment from her, but it's first put out a question.
Sure.
What are the discretionary items that we should be reviewing about?
To answer our Commissioner Siegel, I think a lot of projects that we did push out was the underground rebuilds based on our discussion for Green Acres and waiting for policy. So those budgets, we did move out a little bit another year. Back to discretionary.
And I guess another discretionary item was whether to do a second transmission line.
Right, but that's not really budgeted in here right now, since we don't have a agreement or a cost yet. But we do have some funds set aside in the reserves, but it's not part of this FY20 budget. I think there's like 200,000 set aside for design or negotiations or review.
So if you're replacing the transformer at the Colorado substation, is there any way you could hang on to the old one so it could be a spare if there was a flood or something that washed out the new one?
I think we've already decommissioned it. It was so badly broken. It was
okay. Okay.
unsalvageable, I guess. But we are getting insurance funds for it. I think we're going to get almost $500,000 for it.
I mean, Dave, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the discretionary items that are actionable on a short timeline, like right now, are relatively small, and the larger impact items happen over a longer period. It's a decision about how quickly to replace our aging infrastructure. It's the question about how to rebalance our electric portfolio. It's the question about how much to spend on efficiency and sustainability. Those are the impactful, large-scale shifts that you can make, and we will have conversations on at least two of those items over the next year. Maybe this is an opportunity if there are other specific areas that you want to hear about or want us to come back with more information about, that this is maybe the venue to think about that for the next year.
Well, I'd like the views of others, but seems to be we're presented with a budget where there's very thoughtful. I'm not critical of any of that. I'm just thinking about our oversight function. And it's good to hear that some of these major discretionary policy choices are going to be coming up for discussion. And as we think about the calendar, those ought to be covered during the year so that that's baked into the budget when it comes, and we've had a chance to review those. I don't know that we've done as much of that this last 12 months maybe as we could have on that.
That's noted. We'll take that into account. We've tried to accelerate our rates forecasting process so that the assistant directors, when they're developing their budgets, have that information going into the budget year, but there may be some things that we can do with you folks as well to make sure you're hearing the right information at the right times to be able to have an impact on that budget as well. I will note that one thing that I think did have a lot of impact was the Utility Advisory Commission focus on filling hard-to-fill positions. And there is a budget impact to the most recent SEIU agreement, but one that I think is a positive and important investment.
And we did have a chance to discuss that.
And you did have an impact on that. We had some discussion, and you did have an impact on that push that we made.
Right,
so
thank you.
we want to do more of that if we can.
I don't want to be impolite to Herb Borak, so maybe let him speak now on that, and then we'll return to this.
I appreciate having the opportunity to listen to the question and answers as well. Chair Danaher and Commissioners, I had two comments. The first was on the cross-bore funding decisions. This is a project that examines thousands of sewer laterals, both the city side and the customer side. And as I understand from phase one, about 1% had cross bores from the gas mains. But it appears all the funding's coming from the gas fund, if I understand the information correctly. I mean, they caused the problem with about 1% of what's being inspected, but they're paying for the entire inspection. And I don't know if that's the proper accounting. The second has to do with the advanced metering infrastructure project. Last month, Dean Batcher said that they're planning to replace the meters now instead of waiting for the customer information system. And in regard to what Information Technology Department was doing, he was talking about updating it from one version of SAP to another. And it's not clear whether that's a change now. There'd be a completely different CIS system. But essentially for that AMI project, by putting in the meters first, you're essentially having a foot in the door and saying, well, then the rest of the project depends upon the fact that we put in the meters. And I believe it makes more sense for the council, for the commission and the council to be making a decision on a whole project so that whatever meters are put in and how that information is gotten back to the system here, and the extent to which the customers have real-time information coming back is all decided together. But I think you're just going to say, oh, well, we might as well just make the change now. That's not all you're doing. What you'd be doing is deciding what the future steps are. And I believe it should be made as a project as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. Just back on the electric fund then, questions are raised about the reserves. One item that we hadn't seen in there before, and maybe it was because of Warren's comments, was these pension reserves and the like, that whether the utility bills are enough to cover what the accruals that are coming in that. And maybe this is a question for our council member liaison. Is that something that the UAC should dive into later on or during the year? Or should we be reflecting it in our rates more accurately?
Well, staff can correct me, but I think we are, right? I think the enterprise funds are covering these additional contributions to pensions. And I think
That's correct.
council's pretty active on it, so I don't know if
Okay.
it's worth your time.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, the rates are aligned with council's policy to be proactive funding these liabilities. It's built in.
When you look at these reserve projections, I found that the charts that you use in other presentations that have the lines that show when we're expected to go below our reserve minimum and the like, be very effective way to communicate. And I had a hard time correlating this to what had been showed before. But commissioners, any other questions or comments on the electric fund part of the budget? Seeing none, then I guess the next one in here was, pardon me. Fiber optics fund, I think this is a small part, and this may get subsumed in the larger fiber optics discussion later on, so maybe we can move past this one. Except maybe to note that the 36 million reserve is either too big or perhaps is a source of funding for fiber to the node. On the gas fund, you've given us the allocations. I guess the same question, are there any discretionary items that were left in or left out that commission should have considered? We've covered part of them, was the carbon offset and the like, but anything else in that?
The other big one was the cross-border program and the pace that we replaced the main replacements. Those are large capital dollars.
Okay. Any other questions from folks on the gas? All right. And, pardon me. I'm looking for the water fund in here. Is that, oh, here we go. Again, what big discretionary items that we should be thinking about as we approve the budget?
For the water fund, the biggest one I think is the CIP. It's a reservoir replacement, the tank replacements. I think we have $15 million set aside for next year's CIP work, including those tank replacements.
As we contemplate recycled water initiatives, that comes up in a couple months in our schedule, would that end up in the water budget if big programs are adopted? Is part of the water fund, or is it part of other parts of the city budget?
You can set it up different ways, but I think most likely it'll end up being part of the water fund.
Okay. All right. Any questions from commissioners about the water fund part of it? And then the wastewater fund, which doesn't get a whole lot of attention here.
Actually, on the water, I had one question. I thought I read something about the goal was to reduce usage by 20%, by 2020, and we're at 1%. And I don't know if I'm misreading something there, but that seems to be a pretty big difference.
Are we referring to the key performance measures?
I think these are single-year accomplishments. I think the 20% is cumulative.
Over what time period?
So we've actually, we achieved our 20 by 2020 goals a few years back. And the state is in the process of establishing a new set of efficiency goals and regulations, and we're still working through what those are going to mean. The new objectives involve actually making estimates about the irrigable land within the city and the amount of internal residential per capita internal usage, and setting some benchmarks for what an efficient city should be using based on those metrics. But based on the last round of goals, 20 by 2020, we achieved them several years back, even leaving aside the reduction in usage during the drought.
Back to our earlier discussion about gas, if we're going to have a big push on water conservation, just to be sensitive to this impact, this disproportionate impact to residents who are most compliant, ending up footing a bigger percent of the bill.
That's a good point. All right.
So one of the things that I think has the potential for having an impact is that when AMI is there, that having the leak detection will eliminate the nasty surprise that people get when there's a leak and they don't know about it. So that's one of the benefits that I think we'll see in terms of as the technology gets installed, that will be something that we'll be able to get a benefit on. And I think the issue of rate design and fixed cost, maybe that's something that we could talk about at another session about what might be some strategies, because as you're bringing up on more than one thing, that's just kind of what it is. So how you mitigate that, I think, may need a creative discussion that is not just in the context of approving budgets or rate increases.
Thank you. One item is as we ponder how we do our job better, and Lisa raised this to me this week, I think our fault and staff's is we didn't schedule having a budget committee review things in advance. And I think that is a good practice, and we should make sure we do that next year. And maybe even put it on the rolling calendar, discuss budget process, appoint budget committee. Something to be done in March, perhaps.
Okay. But also to second your point about these issues that are going to be, where there are discretionary opportunity or discretionary decisions that are going to have a big impact on the budget, to make sure that we have if you want our input, make sure that we get that input early enough so that it can get built into the budget, as opposed to trying to have that discussion now when you all have got the budget, pretty well prepared.
We'll schedule a session like next winter or something like that on discretionary budget spending.
Yep, thank you. Commissioners, any other questions, discussion, comments? All right, do you have a resolution for us? Please.
That may be a silly question, I should probably know the answer to, but where does the refuse fund fall? That doesn't fall in utilities?
It's under Public Works. Public Works.
So does wastewater, right?
So it's wastewater treatment, refuse, and the airport.
Yes, thanks.
All right, so the recommendations up on screen. Any further discussion or any motions? AC?
I don't know, do you want to take these one at a time?
Let's take them jointly.
Jointly? I will move the two recommendations.
All right. Is there a second to adopt the two?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor? Aye. Those pass. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Dave and Jonathan, when you get to that point next winter or whatever, we talk about preparing for USC budget, appointing a committee. I think it's also would be good to recirculate this in time in case commissioners have suggestions at that time on different formatting. Like some of the information was not really useful for us, and some could have been more clear for us.
Yeah, if you guys give us that information ahead of time, like even now, that'll be great, and we can share that with the budget team, because it is consistent with the rest of the city's budget.
Yeah.
So we want
And I'm thinking if we do have a point of budget committee next January or something, that would be something we'd ask them to look at too. All right. A brief report on the fiber and AMI planning.
All right. So a couple of changes. Council update is going to be happening now in June instead of May. The May calendar is somewhat full, so we're going to go the first week of June. I think it's June 3rd we're scheduled to go to council with an update. In regards to the RFP with the new scope, we are trying to expand the scope a little bit now. Instead of just focusing on AMI, we're trying to do a more comprehensive strategy with a kind of a cross-utility integration. So we're going to look at other opportunities to leverage our fiber, like underground conversions, underground rebuilds, even under gas replacements. If we're going to do electrification, then maybe we can repurpose those gas mains. So we're going to have the consultant kind of review all these different scenarios and help us maybe put together a master plan.
All right. So the question been raised was whether we're considering the AMI in piecemeal fashion. And I think part of the answer is we did look at it in a comprehensive way a year ago, right, Judith? And made recommendations or adopt that. Looks like some elements have been changing, but I wanted to give Herb an answer to his question on that.
And the idea of whether you put the back-end systems in first or put the meters in first, it's been done both ways. And there are arguments to be made for both of them. And, I think that the advantage of the back-end systems first are that you can offer more day one benefits, but if you've got the funding and the ability to hang the meters first and you're replacing old equipment, then that's a really good argument for doing the equipment first. So even if you don't turn on radios and you don't do all of the functions, it's still, there's a lot of good reasons and history for, that a lot of the utilities have done it that way. So it's not some sort of outside the mainstream to do that.
All right. May I suggest we go over to the 12-month rolling calendar and provide some comments. There are a few points I'll note. One is this list, the next discussion of the carbon accounting methodology for July, although several times you said June. Did you mean?
And I meant June. This was so we had some discussions back and forth about whether we needed to push it off. We're still aiming for June.
Okay.
We may need to push. That said, I mean, if the UAC is looking for a specific month.
June is fine because then we get to a summer holiday. So that's my next question.
Right.
Is typically we take off either July or August. And although we don't have, there'll be a couple of new commission members coming. We won't have everybody here. But wanted to ask if people had a preference
on. The new commissioners will be here the next meeting.
In June.
Yeah.
Yes. So if we could have that discussion at the June meeting, I think that would.
Okay.
Just so you know, the July meeting is actually scheduled for July 3rd, so either we want to cancel or reschedule it because of the holiday. I don't know I think it falls on a Wednesday. July 4th falls on a
Yes,
Thursday.
we should either cancel or reschedule.
Great. All right.
Second the motion. All right. Right now, the June calendar looks fairly light. One of the, I'm just going to mention a few things that came up during the session here. Judith talked about how we might benefit from the DOE presentation on what can be done with AMI. And since we're starting the AMI Institute adoption earlier, and So a question more for you, Judith. Would it be useful to have staff give us a 10-minute summary of that on how DOE thinks AMI might benefit the utility? And
Well, so I certainly think that we would benefit from a presentation on AMI and what the report says. I'm going to make sure that you all and the City Council get the report. Whether our staff is the one to give the report, to give a presentation on that report, I don't know. I mean, whether that's, or whether we should try to get somebody who was involved in developing the report, or maybe someone from EPRI or someone who's local who could sort of give some insight into how these operations took place in different jurisdictions. That might be a really cool thing to do, and I think it would be worth it for this group to get that exposure. So I think it's good to have you guys read it. But I think having somebody who could answer questions about it, because they've been involved with multiple deployments, would be a very useful thing. So I'm happy to make some introductions so that you could have that available in
That would
June.
be great.
Yeah.
all right. So I guess we can leave that to the staff's discretion, but would the commission find that interesting to get a little more in-depth on AMI? Tom? Yeah. You had a question. You were about to reaching for your button.
Different topic, but
Please.
I don't see a joint like council UAC meeting on the schedule. We should
Thank
probably
you.
think about that.
Yeah. Thank you. We've done that at least every 3 years, but a good annual one is.
It's always challenging to schedule with you all.
Yeah. Please.
I had a couple of proposed topics. One, I noticed in the budget, page 392, initiatives, revisit strategy for promoting solar energy. I think that could be a very interesting topic for the UAC if we're talking solar policy or solar strategy. And another one that I've been mulling over for a long time, whether to propose for this group, but I'm personally very interested in methane leakage. And now that we've had our carbon neutral gas plan for a while, I'd be curious to know if there's any appetite on the UAC or on City Council or in the larger community in expanding our carbon neutral gas plan to account for methane leakage. And I don't know if this is a big ask of staff, but I would welcome a discussion of what that might mean if we wanted to eventually move in that direction.
I think it's something that's been raised a lot over the last few years, and I think we've gotten steadily more familiar with it. It would take a little bit of staff work, but I think that's something that we could accommodate. Let's take a look at that.
It's certainly not an urgent has to do in the next month or two, but I'd love to see it at some point.
So you've been doing a lot of leak detection and leak fixes over the last year, according to the summary. So maybe a presentation on what do we know about our leaks in our distribution system.
Well, and I think you're also talking about upstream emissions as well, right?
No, I was thinking
within our system.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading in some report, about leakage and fixing leaks that we live with a certain amount of leakage.
Oh, that's much more straightforward. We actually have all that information. We report it to the DOE every year. We're happy to bring it to you.
Decided to offset the leakage that we know we live with, or could we make reasonable estimates around? I was talking to a graduate student at Stanford who's doing his dissertation on measuring leakage, from appliances. We might not want to go to that level of granularity. I'm just very aware that there's leakage at every stage. Do we want to account for some or all of it and expand our carbon neutral gas plan to account for that?
We actually have all that information. We estimated the carbon emissions from our own system, I think it was about 5 years ago. And it's pretty small. I mean, it's a 1 or 2% difference from our overall consumed emissions. We'd have to just go dig up that estimate and maybe refresh it, and then we can bring it back to you folks.
Well, 1 or 2% if it's leaked as methane instead of combusted as carbon can be pretty significant for greenhouse gas. So I still think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
We had a discussion in our last meeting about, proposed regulation for these underground districts, and I don't know whether you have any time frame for coming back with a revised proposal based on the discussion that we had.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to record action items and I missed that one. Can I ask you to repeat it, please?
Yeah, sure. At our last meeting, we had the discussion about, a regulation, changes to the regulation about how to deal with underground districts and payment for districts that choose to keep their transformers and switches underground. We had given you some suggestions, and I don't know whether there's a plan to come back with a revised proposal for further comments.
Is a thought to see different options presented? I wasn't here in the last
I think the next step was the staff was going to go to council to get their input on on the whole who pays question before it came back to the UAC.
Yeah, I think the folks with the right information aren't here tonight. Neither Dave nor I. We'll get back to you with an update.
I think Commissioner Forzel's correct. Should refresh my recollection, but it would be, I'd be interested at least to know what the schedule is for that going to council, and then.
Just to sort of tie it back to something that they told us today that was new, is that if the CIS is pushed out further, that means the ability to do any automated on-bill financing is pushed out that much further. So to do it manually, 100 bills for, 100 bills manually every single month, you're talking like a human being, a new staff person to do that. So just keep that in mind in terms of the conversation.
Please.
In September, we have a recycled water discussion, and I don't know if it's a separate item, but one thing that came up last night at the meeting was the vulnerability of the plant to sea level rising, and so I don't know if that's a separate item, but I'd like to hear about that. And maybe also, to be thematic, it would be interesting that if he's available and interested to have the Stanford professor come as well.
This is the one that AC referred to.
Right,
I took that down as a follow-up.
All right, I'll at least try to get the slides that he was showing last night and ask him whether he might be available to come.
That'd be great, and if you can pass the name on as well. I mean, I can get a hold of that.
All right.
But, yeah.
All right. One thing, and you actually touched on and answered one of the questions, Jonathan, is, and I've asked from time to time, is, and I'm not trying to make work for staff, but if some analysis has been done of evaluating the cost effectiveness of the bang per buck of different energy efficiency spending programs, it'd be really nice to see how they rate relative to each other and see if we're putting our money in the right places.
So for energy efficiency, we have a very well-established reporting structure. We're going to send you, within the next month or two, we're going to send you the, I'm sorry, my brain is not functioning completely, the DSM report, so demand side management report, and that has a wealth of information on cost effectiveness of even down to individual program levels, but certainly for the portfolio as a whole. So keep an eye out for that, and it may be something that we want to schedule as a discussion so that
At some point, we'll want to integrate it with
talk through it.
Spending choices on how we procure our energy and doing energy offsets. And again, we're looking at holistically where we get the most bang for the buck.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So as it stands in June right now, there's very little listed for discussion. Maybe the carbon accounting moves up there. Part of this discussion was to stimulate requests or ideas from commission members who, if they want topics that are covered that might be short briefings that don't take a lot of staff time to prepare, if there's anything that comes to your mind or. I want you folks to think of this is an ongoing education program, so when there's time in the program to educate us a little more on specific topics, to take advantage of it.
Yeah, there are a couple of items that you folks have brought up that might actually be implementable for June, including the methane. If we have that report and it's quick to refresh, we might be able to have that discussion. Or we might be able to bring a status on, just a status update on the sea level rise efforts that the city's engaged in citywide. I think we're still in the problem definition phase, but that might be interesting.
Okay. All right. Is there any further discussion at that point? Any other topics? Is there a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Second, all in favor? All right, we're done. Thank you.